The town of Borska in the 1880s was small enough to vanish from maps, yet it carried a silence that no traveler ever forgot. At noon each day the church bell struck 12, and the sound seemed to hold the air in its grip like a fist around a throat. Carts halted on cobblestone streets, horses froze mid-step, merchants covered their goods, and shutters closed as if struck by a sudden storm. The town did not fear raiders, nor plague, nor famine. Its fear was of the hour itself, of what returned and what did not. Outsiders thought it superstition, a provincial quirk born of isolation, but within Borska the pattern was carved deeper than ritual. Children were taught from infancy not to play outside at noon. Farmers refused to work their fields when the clock neared 12, even if the harvest spoiled. The silence was not chosen. It was forced by dread. Beneath that silence lay the home of the Janko family, a once respected household that now carried shame like a contagion. Their youngest child, Miroslav, was the source of the noon terror. The story whispered among neighbors was unbelievable, yet it had been proven countless times. Every day at noon, Miroslav died. His collapse was not fainting, not a seizure, not a trick of fragile lungs or weak heart. His body went utterly still, pulse gone, breath absent, lips blue, skin cold. For hours he remained a corpse, stiff as any lying in the cemetery. And yet, when the sun lowered, he rose again, alive as though nothing had happened. This impossible cycle repeated without fail, locking the town in a rhythm of fear that they could neither understand nor escape. The boy himself seemed unaware of the terror he inspired. In the mornings he wandered the garden with pale eyes fixed on flowers, speaking gently to his sister, feeding crumbs to sparrows. At night he ate little, read softly, or sat by the window tracing shapes into the condensation. But always his innocence shattered when noon approached. His family had tried to hide him at first, to pass his weakness off as nerves or childhood illness. Yet word spread, and neighbors who once shared bread and salt at their table now crossed the street to avoid them. Mothers pulled children away. Priests refused blessings. Merchants would not sell to them unless coin was heavy. The Jankos became a household of whispers and shadows, tolerated only because the townsfolk believed that if the boy's family was left intact, perhaps the curse would remain contained within their walls. No one dared to consider what might happen if it spread. There was no doctor willing to stay, no priest willing to perform exorcism. Attempts to move had failed. On their one attempt to travel, Miroslav collapsed in the carriage at noon, and the driver abandoned them on the roadside. From then on, the Jankos never tried to leave again. So the family lived like prisoners, the town like accomplices, all bound to a strange death that came daily with the turning of the sun. Even the animals seemed to know. Dogs whimpered when the bells rang, cows went still in their stalls, and crows gathered on the church spire as if waiting. Noon was the hour of unmaking, and every day the entire town prepared for it. To see the streets, then, was to see life paused, suspended in fear of something both familiar and unbearable. To be a traveler arriving in Borska was to be met not with welcome but with suspicion, for no stranger was permitted to witness what the boy endured. Yet the silence itself was enough to unsettle the hardest wanderer. For who had ever seen a place where time stopped at noon, where men and women cowered at a child's fate, and where death arrived daily not as a thief but as a guest? Miroslav Janko was 12 years old but looked no more than 8. his body light as a bundle of sticks and his face almost too soft for the world around him. His eyes were pale blue, so faint they seemed washed out by sickness, yet they held a strange clarity when he stared too long. His hair, once thick, now clung in thin strands to his head, and though the other boys of the town ran wild through fields, Miroslav drifted like a shadow between his home's garden and the wooden porch, always watched. To strangers he appeared gentle, even angelic. To his family he was both a gift and a curse that could not be spoken of without shame. His parents clung to him in different ways. Ilona, his mother, dressed him as if he were porcelain, tightening every button and smoothing his hair until her hands trembled. Lucas, his father, remained stern, masking his fear and anger, scolding the boy for sitting too long, for coughing too softly, for looking too pale. Their protectiveness felt less like love and more like worship, as if they feared that any small neglect might draw punishment upon them all. The villagers whispered in corners. Some claimed the boy was possessed, others said he was paying for a sin his parents had hidden. A few muttered that the boy was no longer human at all, only a vessel of something that borrowed his form. Yet none dared say it aloud when the family passed, for Miroslav's innocent expression disarmed even the cruelest gossip. He was never seen lashing out, never mocking, never angry. He thanked merchants politely when bread was placed in his hands, and when other children dared to come close, he smiled with such quiet kindness that their mothers dragged them away in haste. What the villagers never saw was how each day dissolved into terror when noon approached. In the final minutes before the bell tolled, Miroslav would grow restless, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy. He would cling to his mother's arm, eyes wide with a fear no child should carry, whispering that he could hear it coming. He never explained what it was, only that the sound grew louder as the sun climbed. Then, without fail, as the church bells struck 12, he collapsed. His small body went rigid, chest unmoving, pupils glassed over as if he had already passed into another world. No breath, no pulse, no warmth. The boy became a corpse before his family's eyes. The first time it had happened years ago, Ilona had screamed so loud that half the town rushed to their door, only to witness the truth with their own eyes. The priest had come, candles and holy water in hand, only to flee hours later when the child sat up at dusk, confused and smiling faintly, as though nothing had happened. From that day, the town's silence at noon became unshakable law. To watch a child die once was unbearable. To watch him die every day was a terror that hollowed people out. For Miroslav himself, there was no memory of what transpired during the hours of stillness. He woke each evening groggy but otherwise unharmed, always asking if the chickens had been fed or if his sister had sung her songs. But beneath his calmness, something unspoken lingered. He sometimes mentioned dreams, shadows with no faces, voices calling his name, hands pressing against him in the dark. When asked, he could never describe them clearly, only shudder and fall silent. Each morning he seemed to forget again, as though the dream slipped away with the dawn. To the villagers, Miroslav's innocent face was unbearable proof that evil could hide behind purity. They pitied him, feared him, and hated the way his family walked through the streets pretending at normal life. But even in their anger, they could not look into his pale eyes without feeling the shiver of something older than sickness, older than superstition. Miroslav was a boy who died every day, and in that endless cycle of innocence and horror, the town felt itself dying too. Dr. Ernst Halvik arrived in Borska on a gray autumn afternoon, his boots muddy from the road, his mind sharpened by curiosity that bordered on arrogance. He was not a man of superstition. He had studied in Vienna, trained in the latest sciences of the body, and built his reputation on investigating mysteries of illness that other doctors dismissed as hysteria. He had heard of the Janko boy through whispers in a distant tavern, rumors of a child who died daily only to rise again as if nothing had happened. Most men laughed off the tale as drunken invention, but Halvik's mind caught fire at the possibility. If it were true, if such a condition existed, then perhaps here lay the key to understanding the thin line between life and death. The villagers greeted him with suspicion, their eyes avoiding his direct gaze. They warned him that no good could come from meddling in what God or devil had claimed. Yet Halvik was unmoved. He carried notebooks, instruments, and an unshakable conviction that science could unmask the horror that bound this town. When he first entered the Janko household, he was struck by the stench of wax and stale air, the thick silence broken only by the creak of floorboards under Ilona's nervous movements. Lucas greeted him coldly, but desperation showed in his eyes. Miroslav was sitting at a table, sketching small shapes onto paper with trembling hands. Halvik's first impression was of fragility. The boy's wrists were thin as twigs, his complexion drained of color. But what unsettled him most was the boy's expression, calm, watchful, as though he already knew why the doctor had come. Halvik introduced himself, his words precise, assuring the family that he sought only to help. Lucas agreed with a curt nod, though Ilona clutched her son as though the very act of observation might wound him. The doctor began with simple examinations. He listened to the boy's chest, took his pulse, measured his breath. All seemed weak, but normal enough. Yet he noted how Miroslav flinched at the sound of the church bell in the distance, as though its toll carried a private terror. Halvik recorded every detail, convinced that the villagers' talk of death at noon was mere exaggeration. But he insisted on seeing for himself, and so the family allowed him to remain in the house until the hour struck. When the church bell rang 12, Halvik leaned close with his instruments. Miroslav stiffened, his pencil falling from his hand, his eyes rolling upward as his body convulsed once and then went limp. Halvik felt immediately for a pulse. Nothing. He pressed his ear to the child's chest. Silence. He watched for breath, for the faintest movement of ribs. Stillness. The body was cold within minutes, the skin blanching as if drained of life. Halvik's professional detachment faltered. He stood frozen, stunned by the completeness of the change. This was no fainting spell. This was death. Hours passed. Halvik remained at the boy's side, checking again and again, scribbling frantic notes. Lucas and Ilona sat motionless, their faces like carved masks, as though they had endured this scene too many times to show grief any longer. At dusk, the boy stirred. His lips twitched, his chest expanded with a sudden gasp, and color returned as if poured back into him. Miroslav blinked, looked around in confusion, and quietly asked for water. Halvik's heart pounded. The boy was alive again, utterly unharmed. No scar, no weakness, only a faint weariness in his eyes. That night, Halvik returned to his room at the inn, unable to sleep. He replayed the event in his mind, struggling against the irrational fear that gnawed at him. He told himself that this was not witchcraft, not divine punishment. It was a condition, a rare malady yet unnamed, a puzzle waiting for the right hands to solve it. But beneath his confidence lay something darker, a thrill he could not admit even to himself. He had not merely witnessed a medical anomaly. He had looked directly at the border of life and death, and for the first time, he wondered if it could be held open. Over the following days, Halvik returned to the Janko house daily, each time with new tools, new methods of measurement. He began timing the exact moment of collapse, comparing temperature changes, even pricking the boy's skin for blood samples. What disturbed him most was the transformation of that blood. At noon it turned black, thick as tar, refusing to clot or flow as though drained of all vitality. By dusk it returned to crimson, flowing as normally as any living child's. The contradiction fascinated him. If the boy's blood could return from death to life, then what else might be reversed? What other barriers might be broken? The villagers grew restless at the doctor's presence, muttering that science would anger whatever force had claimed Miroslav. But Halvik ignored them. Each observation deepened his hunger to know more. He no longer saw a frail child before him. He saw a doorway, a subject upon whom he could test questions no living man had ever dared to ask. Miroslav was no longer just a boy in Halvik's mind. He was a specimen, a phenomenon, perhaps even a key. And with that thought, the doctor's fascination began to harden into obsession, the kind from which cruelty is born. Dr. Halvik's fascination soon eclipsed all restraint. Each morning he arrived at the Janko home carrying new instruments wrapped in cloth. Brass syringes, glass tubes, sharpened rods of copper, and jars of preserved chemicals he had once used sparingly in Vienna. He claimed to Ilona and Lucas that his experiments were harmless, that they might reveal the source of Miroslav's strange affliction and even cure it. But his eyes no longer held the compassion of a healer. They gleamed with a fever that made the boy shrink back in silence. The first tests were cautious. Halvik measured the boy's breath before noon, checked the rhythm of his heart, then leaned close as the church bell began to toll. At the stroke of 12, Miroslav's chest fell still, his eyes glazed, his lips drained to gray. Once again, death consumed him with horrifying perfection. This time, Halvik was ready. He pierced the boy's arm with a needle, drawing the thick black blood into a tube. He marveled at its sluggish crawl, its refusal to carry the bright oxygen of life. He tested its texture between his fingers. It clung like tar, as though it had never belonged to the living at all. By dusk, when Miroslav awoke, the blood inside him flowed red and thin once more. Soon Halvik grew bolder. He whispered that if the boy felt nothing in death, then there was no harm in testing the body more thoroughly. He placed copper rods along Miroslav's chest during the silent hours, pressing them deep enough to puncture but not enough to bleed. The flesh accepted them without resistance, the muscles stiff yet unfeeling. When dusk came and the boy gasped back to life, faint bruises ringed the punctures. But he spoke no complaint. Only in the nights did Ilona hear her son whimper, speaking of dreams filled with fire and faceless hands. She tried to tell Halvik, but he dismissed her as a superstitious mother. The experiments grew darker. Halvik filled syringes with substances meant never to enter a child's veins. Cold mercury, saline, even ground glass diluted in liquid. At noon, he injected them into Miroslav's silent body, watching how the veins darkened or refused to carry the poison forward. He noted each reaction carefully, each anomaly a thrill that kept him awake long past midnight. When the boy revived at dusk, his body showed no trace of the foreign materials, as if whatever realm he entered during death cleansed him of impurities. To Halvik, this was proof of something extraordinary, something that could not be explained by medicine alone. But Miroslav was changing. His eyes, once timid, grew strangely hollow, as though a piece of him did not return each time he awoke. His voice lost its childlike warmth. He answered questions with slow detachment, his words echoing like someone older than his years. He stopped eating much, pushing food away as though his body no longer required it. The villagers noticed, whispering that the boy's soul was thinning, that Halvik was draining it with his instruments. Parents forbade their children from walking past the Janko house, and merchants began refusing to sell even bread to Ilona. Ilona herself watched with breaking heart. Each night she stroked her son's hair as he trembled in half-sleep, whispering of shadows that held him tight when the bells tolled, of voices calling him deeper into their world. He said they left marks on him, not on his skin but inside, places he could not name. She pleaded with her husband to stop the doctor, but Lucas only stared at the floor, his pride eroded by fear. They had allowed this man into their home, and now their silence chained them as firmly as iron shackles. Halvik pressed on. He timed the exact moment of death to the second, charting how quickly the body cooled, how the eyes clouded, how rigor began then mysteriously loosened before dusk. He pricked the boy's flesh with knives, watching how wounds opened then closed as though rewound by unseen hands. It was no longer medicine, no longer curiosity. It was cruelty disguised as science, and he savored the power it gave him, the power to stand where no other man had stood, to witness the undoing of life without consequence. And through it all, Miroslav never protested. He endured each day as though he had already surrendered to the inevitability of being less than human, as though he knew he was no longer a son but an object. Yet sometimes in fleeting moments before noon his pale eyes would fix on Halvik with a look that chilled the doctor despite himself. It was not fear. It was knowledge, a quiet recognition that the boy understood more than he ever confessed. In those seconds Halvik felt as if he were the one being studied, the one lying helpless on the table. But the bells always rang, and death always came, and the doctor's instruments always followed. By winter, Miroslav's body bore faint scars and bruises, reminders of tests that should never have been inflicted upon a child. But to Halvik, these were not signs of cruelty, they were triumphs, stepping stones toward unlocking the deepest mystery of existence. He told himself that one day history would remember him not as a monster, but as a pioneer. Yet in the dark of night, when he replayed the sound of the boy's heart falling silent, he knew what he was becoming. By the turn of the new year, Dr. Halvik's notebooks were filled with pages of cramped script, each line charting Miroslav's daily passage into death. But the more he wrote, the more he felt that simple observation was no longer enough. He wanted control. He wanted to shape the boy's death, not merely record it. So he devised a ritual of needles, an experiment that would test not only the boy's body but also the boundaries of what it meant to be human. At first, the needles were thin, made of polished copper, sterilized in alcohol before insertion. Halvik placed them into Miroslav's chest between his ribs during the dead hours when his body was cold and motionless. He observed how the skin accepted them without resistance, how the boy neither flinched nor bled. Each evening when Miroslav revived, faint red marks appeared where the needles had been, but by morning they faded as if erased. Halvik recorded it with trembling satisfaction, noting that the boy seemed to exist in two different states, one in which pain was absent, and another in which its memory lingered faintly, like echoes in a hollow room. Soon the doctor escalated. He arranged dozens of needles across the boy's chest and arms in precise patterns, mapping them like constellations in the night sky. He pressed them deeper until the points touched bone, until the boy's heart should have been pierced if it had been beating at all. Then he sat and waited, staring at the silent body, daring it to remain dead. When Miroslav awoke, his skin carried thin trails of blood and his breathing was shallow, as though he had carried the weight of those needles into whatever place he went when the bell tolled. Yet he made no complaint, only looked at Halvik with blank eyes that seemed older than any child should bear. The ritual did not end there. Halvik filled the syringes with cold mercury, convinced that if the boy's body could survive such poison, it would reveal the secret of his condition. At noon, while the child lay lifeless, he injected the liquid metal into his veins, watching the silvery trails move sluggishly beneath the skin. Hours later, the mercury was gone without a trace, leaving the boy's flesh pale and clean. To Halvik, this was proof that Miroslav was not bound by ordinary law, that he belonged to some other order of being. To Ilona, it was proof that her son was being stripped of whatever soul remained in him. Miroslav began to change more visibly. His dreams grew louder, filling the house with cries at night. He spoke of a chamber of fire where hands reached through the walls, of faceless figures who waited for him each day when the bells rang. He said their voices echoed inside him, repeating his name in rhythms that matched the toll of the church. When Ilona tried to comfort him, he only whispered that the hands grew stronger each time he returned, that they clung to him even when he awoke. His innocence, once his shield, was fading fast, leaving behind a hollow stillness that frightened even his parents. The villagers began to suspect what Halvik was doing, though they never dared step inside the house. Rumors spread that the doctor was performing forbidden rituals, that the boy's blood was being traded for knowledge. Some whispered that the boy no longer died naturally, that it was Halvik himself who called death upon him with his instruments. Mothers warned their children never to look toward the Janko windows when noon approached. The family, once pitied, now became a mark of horror, a house that reeked of death even in daylight. Halvik, however, felt no shame. In his mind, Miroslav was a vessel, a rare specimen that nature itself had chosen for him. He believed he was documenting the mechanics of death, preparing humanity for a future where life and mortality could be bent at will. Yet even as he scribbled his findings, a part of him sensed that the boy was no longer simply enduring the rituals. Miroslav was changing, becoming something beyond child or victim, as if death itself had begun to seep into him permanently. And with each needle pressed into his flesh, with each injection of foreign substance, The boy drifted further from the world of the living, further into silence. The ritual of needles marked a turning point. No longer was Miroslav just a boy who died at noon. He was now a canvas upon which pain and science were carved, his body both experiment and altar. The household lived in dread of each approaching hour, yet none could stop what was happening. For by then it was not only the doctor's obsession that bound them, but the boy's own quiet surrender. Ilona Janko had carried her secret for years, swallowing it like a shard of glass that cut her each time she breathed. To the villagers she was only a pale mother, worn thin by her son's affliction, but within her chest lay the truth of how it had all begun. One evening after Halvik had left with his notebooks and glass tubes, she sat beside the boy's bed, smoothing his damp hair as he whimpered in sleep. Her lips trembled with words she had never dared to share. When at last Lucas dozed drunk by the fire, she turned to Halvik and confessed. It had been during the famine, she whispered, when food ran out and children wasted away in every house. Miroslav had been an infant then, his skin gray, his cries thin. Desperate, she had taken him to the convent at the edge of the woods, a cloister of silent nuns who lived apart from the town. They had offered her no kindness, no bread or medicine. Instead, they spoke in signs and gestures, demanding something of her in exchange for the child's survival. That night, they performed a ritual that even now twisted her stomach to recall. A lamb was slaughtered, its heart placed upon an altar of salt. They cut her palm, mingled her blood with the lamb's, and pressed the infant's lips to the mixture. Then they prayed, not to the God she knew, but to something else, something that answered with stillness in the air and a ringing in her ears. From that night forward, Miroslav never fell ill again. He thrived while other children withered, his body untouched by the sickness that claimed the town's little ones. Ilona convinced herself it was a miracle, a reward for her sacrifice. But when the boy turned 7, the deaths began. At noon, every day he would fall silent, lifeless, and each evening he would return. She had begged the nuns for help, but when she went back, the convent stood empty, abandoned as though no one had lived there for years. Halvik listened with cool detachment, his eyes narrowing not in disbelief but in calculation. He dismissed her tale as superstition, an invented memory to give shape to the unexplainable. To him, the nuns were irrelevant, their rituals only coincidence. What mattered was the boy himself, the living evidence before him. Yet Ilona knew that science could not wash away the guilt in her bones. She had bargained with something nameless to keep her child alive. And now he paid the price every day. Her confession became a turning point in the household. Lucas, once the stern protector, could no longer hide his despair. He began to mutter curses at night, slamming his fist against the table, accusing Ilona of bringing damnation upon them all. He drank heavily, his hands trembling as he poured glass after glass. Miroslav, hearing their arguments, withdrew further into silence, staring at the walls as though the shadows there spoke more kindly than his parents. For Halvik, the story only added fuel to his obsession. He told himself that if rituals had begun this cycle, then science could end it, or better, master it. He cared nothing for lamb hearts or prayers. He cared only for the mechanics of death and return. And so he redoubled his experiments, driven by a conviction that the boy was not cursed but chosen, a specimen that could unlock knowledge denied to mankind. Ilona, however, began to crumble. Each time she watched her son collapse at noon, she felt the weight of her bargain pressing harder on her chest. She whispered apologies into his ear as he lay lifeless, though he could not hear them. At night she lit candles in the corners of the house, praying to a god she feared no longer listened. She dreamed of the convent, of faceless nuns chanting in voices like stone, and she woke with her hands bleeding, though no knife had touched her. By then, the Janko household was no longer a family but a cage, and Ilona knew she had built it with her own hands. She had saved her son once, but in doing so, she had given him to something worse than death. By the spring of the following year, Miroslav was scarcely recognizable as a child at all. His cheeks had hollowed, his skin clung thinly to bone, and the faint warmth of playfulness that once lingered in his gestures had drained away completely. Where other boys wrestled in the mud or climbed apple trees, Miroslav sat for hours staring at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. The village children no longer dared whisper his name, let alone play near him. He had become a figure they feared in the same way they feared the cemetery at night. Silent, cold, a reminder of something they could not understand. Dr. Halvik, however, saw only progress. The more he cut and pierced and measured, the less Miroslav reacted. At first, there had been faint cries in the evenings, muffled whimpers of pain when the needles were removed. But as the weeks dragged on, even those faded. Halvik could press the tip of a scalpel into the boy's thigh, watching a thin line of blood trail down, and Miroslav would not even blink. He recorded each test meticulously, convinced he had discovered a state of existence between death and life where sensation itself was suspended. He called it the threshold, and Miroslav had become its unwilling prisoner. Ilona saw the change with growing dread. Her son no longer asked for food, no longer clutched at her hand when the bells tolled. He would sit quietly, his pale eyes fixed on nothing, waiting for noon like one waits for an appointment. Once she tried to tickle his ribs as she had when he was small, desperate to see him laugh. He only looked at her unblinking, as though he had forgotten what laughter was. The boy who had once sung softly to sparrows was gone. What remained was a vessel that endured. The villagers, too, sensed the transformation. They whispered that Miroslav no longer carried a soul. Mothers pulled their children inside when he passed. Fathers muttered that he was an omen of pestilence. Even the priest avoided him, crossing himself when their paths neared. Animals reacted most strongly. Dogs whimpered and hid. Horses refused to be led past the Janko house, and cats arched their backs, spitting at the boy as if he were a predator rather than prey. The isolation grew so complete that the Janko home became a tomb in the center of town, a place where no laughter, no prayers, and no human warmth could survive. And yet every noon the ritual continued. Miroslav would stiffen, collapse, and lie motionless while Halvik pressed needles into his flesh or measured his blood as it turned black. The villagers, huddled in their homes, prayed silently that his curse would not spill over into their lives. When he rose again at dusk, they breathed relief but also shame, for they knew his suffering allowed them to carry on their ordinary routines. Some believed that the boy's daily deaths acted as a shield for the town, sparing them from plague or famine. Others whispered that his endurance was feeding something darker, a hunger that would one day demand more than just a child. Miroslav himself seemed to accept his fate with a stillness that was almost unnatural. He no longer resisted Halvik's tests, no longer cried in his sleep, no longer reached for his mother's comfort. When he did speak, his words were distant, spoken in a tone that carried no emotion. He once told Ilona, "It doesn't hurt anymore." The words should have soothed her, but instead they hollowed her deeper, for she realized he did not mean the needles or the knives. He meant everything. Hunger, fear, joy, warmth, all of it had left him. For Halvik, this was proof of success. He declared to Lucas that the boy had crossed the boundary into a state where human weakness no longer applied. He described it as purity, a mind and body untouched by suffering because they had learned to exist in silence. But to Ilona it was a death worse than any coffin. Her son was alive in body, but his spirit was slipping away day by day, leaving behind only a husk that bore his face. By then, Miroslav was no longer just a child cursed to die at noon. He was a mirror in which the town saw its own cowardice, its willingness to let innocence be destroyed so long as the curse stayed contained. And though no one dared admit it aloud, they all knew. The boy who once felt everything now felt nothing at all, and that emptiness was more terrifying than death itself. Halvik's journals from that spring grew darker, his handwriting jagged as though written in fever. Observing the boy was no longer enough. He wanted to command the very moment of death, to summon it and banish it at will. In his mind, Miroslav was not a patient but a living instrument, a device through which he could test the mechanics of mortality. And so, he built the clock. The contraption was assembled in the cellar of the Janko home. Halvik worked for weeks, scavenging gears from broken farm tools, rods from blacksmith scraps, and iron from discarded stoves. Piece by piece, he shaped a machine that resembled a great wheel with sharp points protruding like the teeth of a beast. At its center, he fashioned a harness lined with metal braces sized perfectly to hold Miroslav's frail body. Attached to the gears were weighted hammers that struck inward at precise intervals, each blow designed to pierce skin, to tap bone, to remind the body that time was passing even as it lay in death. The mechanism was crude but exact, powered by winding cranks that ticked steadily like a heartbeat. Halvik called it his death clock. The first time he strapped Miroslav into it, Ilona collapsed on the floor, clawing at Halvik's legs, begging him to stop. Lucas stood motionless, too broken by shame and drink to resist. Halvik silenced them both with cold words. This was not cruelty, he said, but progress. If they wished to understand the curse that bound their son, they must allow him to test its limits. Against their cries, he fastened the boy into the iron frame. When the bell struck 12, Miroslav fell limp, his head lolling against the brace. The machine ticked forward, its gears grinding, and the first hammer struck, driving a steel spike shallowly into his chest. There was no cry, no resistance, only the dull sound of metal meeting bone. With each tick of the clock, another strike followed, stabbing into his ribs, his arms, his legs. Halvik watched with rapt attention, recording the rhythm of impact against the stillness of the boy's body. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. By the time dusk neared, Miroslav's flesh was marked with dozens of punctures, thin trails of blackened blood seeping from each wound. Then, as always, he breathed again. His eyes opened wide. His chest shuddered and he gasped as though surfacing from deep water. But this time, when he spoke, his voice was faint and trembling. "It was louder," he whispered, though no one asked what he meant. Halvik scribbled the words into his notebook, convinced they were proof that Miroslav's consciousness lingered in some realm even as his body lay still. The experiments continued, each day harsher than the last. Halvik adjusted the timing of the strikes, sometimes making them faster, sometimes slower, sometimes delaying them altogether to see if death would come earlier or later. To his astonishment, the boy's collapse began to shift. No longer did it occur precisely at noon. Some days it arrived minutes later, others earlier, as if the cycle itself had grown unstable. Halvik believed this was proof that his machine was working, that he was bending the schedule of death itself. The thought filled him with a godlike thrill. But with each experiment, Miroslav deteriorated. His once pale eyes dimmed to gray, his lips cracked, his frame shrank to near skeletal. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was only to mutter about the ticking. "It follows me," he said once, his voice barely a breath. "Even when I'm not here, I hear it." Ilona wept at his words, but Halvik dismissed them as hallucinations. He could not see that the boy's mind was unraveling under the weight of repeated crossings. The villagers soon learned of the clock. They had not seen it, but they heard its grinding through the cellar walls, the unnatural rhythm that echoed across the square at noon. They called it the devil's heartbeat, and they feared it more than the curse itself. Whispers spread that Halvik had replaced God's law with his own, that he had built a machine to command death. Some even believed that each strike of the clock took not only from Miroslav but from them, that the curse was spreading into their own bones. The town grew restless, families packed their belongings and fled to neighboring villages. The priest locked the church at noon, refusing to let the bell ring, but the silence only deepened the dread. Those who remained in Borska lived in constant fear of what might come next. To them, Miroslav was no longer just a cursed boy, but the center of something vast and unnatural. A doorway that the doctor had forced open with iron and gears. Halvik, blind to their fear, pressed on. He grew gaunt, his hands shaking from sleepless nights, his hair falling in clumps, but his eyes blazed with mania. In his mind, he was close to revelation. He believed that by manipulating the boy's death, he was touching the very fabric of eternity. He began to wonder whether Miroslav was not simply cursed, but chosen, placed in his hands by Providence for this very purpose. Yet beneath his triumph lay a creeping dread he would not admit even in his journals. The machine had begun to tick on its own, even when unwound. In the nights when he slept in the Yanko house, he swore he heard it echoing faintly in the boy's breathing, as though Miroslav himself had become the clock. And sometimes when Halvik looked into the boy's eyes at dusk, he felt that Miroslav was not returning from death alone, that something else was coming back with him, something that watched through his gaze. By then, the line between experiment and ritual had blurred completely. The clock was no longer a machine of science, but an altar of cruelty, each strike of its spikes a sacrifice made to knowledge no man should possess. And though the boy endured, each noon carried him further from humanity, leaving behind not a child, but a vessel ticking in rhythm with death itself. Lucas Janko had once been the pride of Borska, a man whose voice carried authority at market, whose shoulders bore the weight of harvest and family alike. But by the time Halvik's machine had taken hold of his household, he was a ghost of himself. His back stooped, his beard unkempt, his hands stained not with soil but with the tremor of drink. Each day he watched his son strapped into iron, punctured and prodded, and each day a piece of him withered. At first he told himself it was for the boy's salvation. He let Halvik work, believing perhaps that suffering might bring healing, that the man's instruments might wrestle the curse into something manageable. But as the weeks turned into months, Lucas saw only torment with no end. He saw Miroslav's thin body marked with scars, his hollow eyes empty of childhood. And worse, he saw his wife Ilona whispering in corners, muttering prayers to shadows, lighting candles not to God but to whatever she believed listened now. The house no longer smelled of bread and stew, it smelled of wax, iron, and fear. Lucas began to drink heavily, retreating to a corner each night with a bottle, his rage thick on his tongue. He cursed Halvik, cursed the boy, cursed himself most of all. He raged at Ilona for her bargain with the nuns, for bringing a curse into their home, though in truth he envied her devotion. At least she still clung to belief while he had nothing left. He saw only a son condemned to die daily, and parents too weak to stop it. One night, driven by a mixture of desperation and despair, Lucas crept into his son's room as the boy lay in post-noon stillness. Miroslav's body was pale and rigid, his lips parted slightly as though in eternal rest. Lucas pressed a pillow over the boy's face, his hands shaking as he whispered through tears that he would free him, that death should not be mocked with return. But as he pressed harder, he realized the truth. There was no breath beneath the pillow, no resistance, no life to smother. He had come too late. Death had already claimed him for those hours. Lucas dropped the pillow, sobbing, and stumbled from the room. By dawn, when Miroslav opened his eyes once more, Lucas was gone. He left no word, no belongings, only the faint stench of spirits lingering in the kitchen and the hollow creak of a door left ajar. Ilona searched, calling his name through the fields, but no one answered. The villagers said they had seen him walking down the road toward the river, his figure unsteady, his head bowed. Some claimed he drowned himself, others that he wandered into the forest to die. None truly knew and none cared to follow. His absence left the household broken beyond repair. Ilona clung harder to her rituals, her son grew ever more silent, and Halvik continued his experiments without obstacle. The father who might have stopped it had vanished, leaving only his shadow on the walls and the memory of a man who once held his family together. In his absence, the boy's suffering deepened, and the clock ticked louder, as though mocking the silence Lucas left behind. Halvik's obsession with capturing death's language soon led him to an invention that seemed almost grotesque in its simplicity. He acquired an early phonograph from Vienna, a bulky device of brass and horn, its wax cylinders fragile but precise. Where others saw novelty for music, Halvik saw a chance to record what no human ear should ever hear. The sound of a heart that died daily. He fixed the horn against Miroslav's chest during the dead hours. The child's body bound to the table, cold and motionless. The machine whirred softly, its needle etching invisible grooves into the wax. Halvik expected silence, for a dead heart has no rhythm. Yet when he replayed the cylinder, the horn released not stillness but whispers. At first they were faint, low moans, fragments of sound like wind pressing through a tunnel. But as he leaned closer, he swore he heard voices. Childlike sobbing, words in no language he knew, cries that rose and fell as though hundreds spoke at once from behind a wall. He played the recording again and again, each time convinced the voices grew clearer, closer. Ilona, standing in the doorway, clutched her chest in horror when she heard them. "Those are not my sons," she whispered, but Halvik dismissed her, scribbling furiously in his journal. Over the following days, he repeated the experiment, recording at every noon. Each cylinder revealed something new. Laughter twisted into weeping, chants in cadences that matched the church bell's toll, shrieks that clawed at the ear. When he set the machine aside, the echoes lingered in the room as though the walls themselves remembered the sound. The boy awoke each evening pale and trembling, whispering that the voices followed him now into his dreams. He told his mother he no longer felt alone in the silence, that they touched him, held him, pressed against him while he lay still. The villagers soon learned of the recordings, though none had heard them directly. Word spread that Halvik had trapped spirits in cylinders, that he had given the dead a mouthpiece. One evening he played the phonograph for a group of townsfolk who had gathered outside in defiance. The sounds that poured from the horn were enough to send them scattering into the night. Some swore they heard their dead children's cries in the chaos, others that the devil himself spoke through the machine. By morning, half the square stood empty, families having fled Borska entirely. For Halvik, the recordings were proof of his genius. He believed he had uncovered evidence that death was not an end, but a passage filled with voices, an entire world existing parallel to the living. He grew convinced that Miroslav's heart was not merely stopping, but opening a door, and the phonograph was capturing what seeped through. Yet even as he celebrated, Ilona watched her son's hollow frame curl in bed, his hands clamped over his ears, though no sound filled the room. The boy who had once been silent now trembled at the noise of things only he could hear. By winter, Miroslav was no longer a child, but a ruin. His body was so thin the bones pushed sharp against his skin, his eyes sunken into shadows, his lips cracked and bloodless. The house smelled constantly of iron and wax, the air heavy with the scent of rot that no fire could cover. Halvik, gaunt from sleepless nights, insisted that the boy's endurance was nearing revelation, that one final experiment would prove his theories beyond doubt. Ilona, broken by grief, had stopped resisting. She hovered near her son like a ghost, whispering prayers no god seemed to hear. On the last day of December, the machine was wound once more. The death clock, its iron teeth gleaming in the pale light, waited in the cellar like an altar. Halvik strapped Miroslav into its embrace, fastening each metal brace with trembling hands. The boy offered no protest. His eyes stared at the ceiling, empty of fear, empty of hope. Ilona knelt nearby, her hands clasped, tears sliding silently down her face. Lucas was gone, the house hollow without him, and so there was no one left to resist. The church bell struck 12. Miroslav's chest stilled, his body slack against the iron frame. The gears began to turn, the hammers striking in cruel rhythm. Metal spikes pressed into bone, into ribs, into the silent heart. Halvik leaned close, scribbling notes as though each puncture were scripture. Hours passed. The room grew colder, the boy's flesh stiff and gray. Dusk approached, and still there was no breath, no stir, no return. Ilona's sobs grew louder, echoing off the stone walls, but Halvik ignored her. He wound the machine tighter, desperate, certain the boy would awaken. Night fell. The clock struck its last and fell silent. Miroslav's body remained still, his eyes open wide, glassy and unblinking. For the first time in years, the curse had not ended. The boy did not breathe again. His daily resurrection was broken. Halvik's triumph curdled into dread. He touched the child's hand and recoiled. The skin was slick with a black liquid that oozed from the pores, seeping into the wood of the machine, corroding it. The stench burned his nostrils, and when it touched his skin, it blistered. Ilona screamed as the substance dripped from her son's mouth, staining his teeth, flowing like tar across the floor. Yet the most terrible thing was his gaze. Though lifeless, his eyes did not close. They stared upward, fixed on Halvik with a hollow clarity that seemed to accuse, to watch, to wait. The doctor staggered back, clutching his hand, his notes scattering into the black puddles. He realized in that moment he had not mastered death. He had only shattered the barrier that kept it contained. Ilona collapsed beside her son, clutching his limp body to her chest, rocking as though he were still the infant she once held. Her wails rose into the rafters, raw and unbroken, while Halvik sank into silence. The experiment had ended, but not with revelation, not with glory. It had ended with a boy left as a corpse, his final breath stolen by iron and obsession. Outside, the town bells rang midnight, but in the Janko cellar, time seemed to stop. The machine stood corroded, the doctor trembling, the mother broken, and the boy, eyes open, watching still, though his heart would never beat again. After Miroslav's final death, the house grew quieter than the grave. The boy's body lay shrouded in the cellar, his eyes still open, refusing to close even under his mother's trembling hands. Halvik sealed his notes and kept to his room, his burned flesh wrapped in rags, muttering half-thoughts to himself about thresholds and doorways. But outside the walls of the Janko home, the town began to feel the curse shift. The fear that had once centered on one boy now spread through every cradle, every womb. The first stillbirth came within a week. A farmer's wife screamed through the night, her child delivered cold and blue, then another and another. Mothers wept over lifeless infants, fathers dug tiny graves until the earth of the cemetery was pocked with fresh mounds. In a town where children had once been its heartbeat, silence now echoed through the streets. By spring, no child cried in Borska. Every birth ended in death. Every lullaby became a mourning song. The villagers whispered that Miroslav's daily deaths had been their shield, that his suffering had paid the price for their own children to live. With him gone, the debt returned, collected without mercy. Shame and dread cloaked the streets. Women stopped gathering at the well, ashamed of their swollen bellies that carried only doom. Men stopped working their fields, their strength broken by grief. The marketplace emptied, shops shuttered, livestock sold off to strangers in neighboring towns. One by one, families abandoned their homes, fleeing with hope that distance might save them. But even those who left carried the curse. Word spread of women miscarrying on the road, of infants born still in villages far away. It was as if Miroslav's death had unchained something that no border could hold. Inside the Janko house, Ilona became a shadow, wandering the fields, clutching scraps of her son's clothing to her chest. She was seen walking barefoot along the frozen river, whispering to the wind as if she still heard her child's voice in it. Neighbors claimed she spoke to him at night, that her candles glowed through the windows until dawn, casting strange shadows across the walls. Some swore they saw her holding conversations with the empty air, her lips moving gently, tenderly, as though rocking a baby that was no longer there. The house itself grew feared beyond all others. Children, if any still lived long enough to walk, were warned never to go near. Stray animals prowled the edges but would not cross the gate. The cellar door was nailed shut, yet villagers whispered that faint ticking could be heard from within on cold nights, as if the death clock still wound itself, as if Miroslav's heart had never truly stopped. The priest attempted one final mass for the town, gathering the remaining families in the church. But when he raised his voice in prayer, his words cracked, his throat dry, and he fell silent halfway through. No one finished the prayer. No one believed anymore. Faith had withered as surely as the wombs of the town. By the end of the year, Borska was no longer a living town, but a husk. The laughter of children was gone, the school shuttered, the streets lined with abandoned carts. Those few who stayed walked with hollow eyes, their steps slow, as though waiting for their own turn to be claimed. The curse had achieved what famine and plague could not. It had killed the future itself. And so, Miroslav's story ended not only with his final breath, but with the silencing of an entire generation. His suffering, once contained within the walls of his home, had spilled into the veins of the town until every birth was a funeral, every lullaby a dirge. The boy who had died daily had been their shield, and when the shield was broken, nothing remained but graves. Years after the last families abandoned Borska, long after the Yanko house stood alone in its decay, Dr. Ernst Halvik's words surfaced in the world beyond. His suicide came quietly, discovered in a rented flat in Vienna. He had swallowed poison, leaving his body curled beside a desk stacked high with journals and sealed manuscripts. They were labeled with titles that sounded more like sermons than science. The Portal Boy on the Threshold of Silence, Notes from Beyond the Pulse. His colleagues who opened the documents recoiled at what they read. The writings were not clinical accounts, but confessions etched in the hand of a man tormented by obsession. In page after page, Halvik described Miroslav not as a patient, but as a vessel, a doorway to what he called the Black Interval. He wrote of the boy's daily deaths as though they were holy rites, moments when the veil of life lifted and revealed a chamber filled with voices. He admitted with a mixture of awe and guilt that his experiments had ceased to be about cure or explanation. They had become sacrifices made to that interval. Each needle, each spike, each recording meant to coax more of its secrets into the open. His most chilling lines described the boy's eyes. Each dusk, he wrote, when the child returned, he brought something with him. The gaze no longer belonged to him alone. I was seen, studied, judged. He confessed that by the end he no longer believed the boy truly lived when he returned. Instead, he was convinced something else occupied the shell, wearing the child's face, testing its voice. What rose from that table was not the boy I bound down, he wrote. It was a reflection from the other side, and it looked upon me as one might look upon an insect, Authorities who examined the manuscripts branded them blasphemous, a mingling of science with sorcery. Most copies were confiscated, locked away in archives never meant to be opened. Yet whispers spread. In universities and asylums, doctors hungry for notoriety traded copies of certain passages, eager to replicate Halvik's methods. Some even sought children with strange conditions, experimenting with drowning, suffocation, and resuscitation in the hope of brushing against the threshold Halvik had described. In this way, the suffering of one boy echoed outward, shaping cruelties in places far beyond Borska. For the villagers who had fled, news of Halvik's suicide confirmed what they had long believed, that the doctor had courted forces beyond human reach and that those forces had finally claimed him. To them, his death was justice, but it brought no closure. The women who had lost children, the fathers who had dug tiny graves, carried their grief into foreign towns where no one believed their story. They lived as wanderers, haunted by memory, carrying the shadow of Borska wherever they went. Ilona's fate was scarcely mentioned in Halvik's papers, but in one final note he admitted he sometimes saw her in the fields long after Miroslav's death, cradling cloth bundles as though still carrying her son. She whispered to what was not there. He wrote, "And I envied her devotion, for she loved even the absence, while I loved only the silence." It was the only line in all his journals that bore a trace of regret. In the end, Halvik's confession revealed not only the story of a boy cursed to die daily, but the story of a man consumed by the hunger to control what should never be touched. He wrote as if he were both priest and executioner, kneeling before the altar of his own invention. His last words on paper were a warning, though whether written in fear or pride, no one could say. Once the door is opened, it does not close. The town of Borska did not survive a generation beyond Miroslav's death. Roofs collapsed under snow, weeds split the cobblestones, and windows gaped like blackened eyes. Travelers who passed through found silence so deep it pressed against their skin as if the earth itself remembered what had happened there. The Janko house stood longest, its cellar door nailed shut, but even that crumbled into rot. Only a stone remained, placed quietly by hands no one claimed. It bore no name, no date, only a cross scratched faintly into its surface, a marker for a child who had died too many times to count. Centuries later, historians unearthed fragments of Halvik's writings in forgotten archives. They pieced together the tale of the boy who died at noon, the machine that pierced him, the voices captured in wax. Scholars debated whether it was folklore dressed as fact, or fact buried beneath superstition. Some dismissed it entirely, while others shivered at the patterns. Reports of vanished convents, of villages where children stopped being born, of doctors who experimented in silence. The story became less about a single boy and more about the question he embodied: how far humanity will go to explain what should never be touched. Borska itself became a place of whispers. Pilgrims left flowers at the unmarked stone, though none admitted why. Writers told the story as parable, warning of science unmoored from mercy, of faith traded for bargains in the dark. The boy's name faded, but his suffering left a legacy etched deeper than memory. He had been made into an altar by those who should have loved him most, his innocence sacrificed to knowledge that gave nothing back. And so his story ended not with triumph, nor even with terror, but with silence. The silence of a house abandoned, a town without children, and a grave that bore no name.